Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. Well, the new year is upon us, which means that it is time to review all of the books that I read in the prior year. I didn't read as many as I would have liked, but I have read some pretty good ones, and I'm here to talk about them with you all. We're going to go down the list. I'm going to give a short review of each book and how I feel about it and whether or not I would recommend it. So, let's get started. Alright, the first book I read this year was a book called A Congregation of Jackals by S. Craig Zowlar. Would you describe this book? Congregation of Jackals is a grindhouse horror western. It is an excellent book, very well written, as is pretty standard when it comes to Zowlar. When you read or watch a Zowlar product, you expect it to be of high quality, like Race to the Broken Lands, which is another book of his I've read that's also pretty excellent, or Bone Tomahawk, which is a movie he directed, same with Dragged Across Concrete or Brawl in Cell Block 99. I would say that if you're new to Zowlar's style, definitely start with Congregation of Jackals. It is the least Zowlar-ish of the bunch. Congregation of Jackals follows Oswald Danford and three other former members of an outlaw gang in 1888. Three of the outlaws are invited to a wedding by a fourth who claims that he has received a threatening letter from their former boss. The boss basically threatens the four of them and says that if they are not at the wedding, everyone at the wedding will be massacred. The four outlaws take this very seriously, and despite the fact that they are trying to leave the outlaw life behind and trying to move on to better and greater things, like having families and settling down, they are called back into this old life that they had fought so hard to run from. The book is very well written. Very tense. It is a very intense book. I remember holding my breath at one part. The characters are very well written. It's not a very long book, as you can see. It's 200 pages max, but it's excellent. I don't know how Zowlar does it. It's the same thing with Race to the Broken Land as well. That's also not a very long book. Zowlar is able to pack so much atmosphere, so much tension, so much good character work and plot inside of such a small package. And Congregation of Jackals is no exception to this. The book has lots of really good setups and payoffs. There are so many small little details and stuff like that. There's lots of twists and turns in the plot. I'm not going to give too much away. That's why I'm trying to be vague, because it is a very surprising read, very tense read, and I would highly suggest reading A Congregation of Jackals. I'm going to give it a solid 9 out of 10. It is a pretty good book. If you are queasy, if you do not have the stomach for violence and gore, don't read any of Zowlar's work or watch any of Zowlar's work. Now, you may be saying to yourself, oh, I can handle it. I read Stephen King. I'm just going to say, Zowlar blows Stephen King out of the water. Like, imagine some of the worst stuff that you've seen or read in a Stephen King novel. Zowlar's is probably worse. Zowlar, what he likes to do is basically hold all of the really gruesome violence until like the last half of the book. He likes to build characters up. He likes to get you used to them. He wants you to like them. And then he mercilessly slaughters them. One thing I really like about Zowlar's work is that Zowlar is no fan of plot armor. The main characters of these novels and of these books are not immune to pain, suffering, or death. That character you really like could vanish just like that. He could literally just be brutally slaughtered like an animal. And it's excellent. He does a great job. The character work is great. The arcs are great. The characters themselves are extremely believable. The dialogue is very well written. It is just an excellent book from a very underrated author, in my opinion. I think people should check out more of Zowlar stuff, but again, if you're not really into suffering, torture, and violence and stuff like that, don't check out Zowlar's stuff. Next on the list is First Conspiracy by Brad Meltzer and Josh Minsk. I can't speak today. I promise I can read, though. The First Conspiracy is a really good book. The First Conspiracy is a history book about the planned assassination of General George Washington during the Revolutionary War. During those days, George Washington was pretty much everyone's hope. George Washington was a well-known man at that time. He was a hero. He had already fought some wars and battles and has already gained himself a bit of a name. And at this point, this small ragtag military that's been thrown together basically just has all of their hopes in General George Washington. And People on the British side, the loyalists, are very aware of this, so plan to kill him. It's a very interesting book. I think it's pretty great. I would definitely recommend this if you're into Revolutionary era history, or just history in general. It's pretty well written. Lots of things in it that are really interesting, and you could see something like this being like in a movie or a TV show. My favorite bit of trivia from it is the fact that George Washington's brother had smallpox, and before he died, George himself was infected with it and almost died. He made it through, but he almost died. He was only 17 at the time. And years later, during a smallpox epidemic that was sweeping through the military camps, if I'm not mistaken, the British were trying to send their own troops that were infected with smallpox into the camp. And it was killing people all over the camp, except for George Washington. And I just found that so funny that the one guy they were trying to kill, he just didn't get killed. It's a pretty good book. I don't know if I would say it's the best book ever written about George Washington, but if you are interested in the first president of the United States, or some of the birth of what we understand as espionage in America and special forces, and a lot of the stuff is detailed in this book. Pretty interesting read. Would recommend. A solid 7 out of 10. Third book I read this year was The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. This is probably the best book I have read in a really long time. I could talk for hours about how excellent this book is. I am new to the Brandon Sanderson fan base, and a lot of people were saying that if you're going to get introduced, you should probably read Mistborn. That's what everyone says. Mistborn's a good starter book. It basically gives you everything you need to know about Brandon Sanderson. I had been watching Brandon Sanderson's writing lectures to perfect my own craft. But I realized as I was watching, I was like, I've never even read any of this guy's books. I need to check them out. And everyone was saying that Mistborn was one you start with, but everyone agreed that his masterpiece was The Way of Kings, of the Stormlight Archive series. So I was like, okay, I'm going to do something here. I haven't had a good fantasy series to read since The Dark Tower. So what I'm going to do, instead of reading Mistborn, I'm going to go in for the long haul, and I'm going to read The Way of Kings. It did take me a little bit to read. As you can see, it's a chunky book. I think how many pages is it? It's like 1,300 plus pages. Yeah, nearly 1,300 pages long. Excellent book. Beautifully written book. I don't even know what to say about it that other people haven't said, because this book is highly beloved, and it deserves every bit of praise it gets. It's an excellent fantasy novel. One of the very best I've ever read. The plot is essentially the king in this universe has been assassinated by an unknown assassin. Well, the audience knows who he is, but no one else does. What the audience also doesn't really understand is the why the king was assassinated. The assassination, of course, starts a really long war against people that had been made peace with, and basically we're following in these events as certain characters go through certain things. You have Kaladin, who went from being an acclaimed spearman to suddenly just being a slave. It's really hard to describe the plot of this book. Like, you can give a small plot summary of something like Congregation of Jackals, right? Because it has a small plot. It's hard to give a small plot summary of a book this big. I don't even know if I should describe the plot to you other than to tell you to go read it yourself, because the book really is that excellent. It is the best book I have read, fiction book I have read, in a very long time. I could praise it for hours, but since we don't have that kind of time, I will just simply end on a recommendation. Pick this book up, and I would easily give this a 9, maybe even a 10 out of 10. It's got excellent characters, an excellent plot, excellent setups, excellent payoff, and with hints of bigger things to come. I'm very excited to read the rest of this series because this book was so good. And I'm told that some of the books are actually better than this one, and if that's the case, wow, I don't even know how you can beat this book. This book is so good. Highly recommend. 10 out of 10. Go read it. Next book, well, 2 books I have on the list are 2 books that I unfortunately do not have with me. They are The War on Art and How to Turn Pro by Stephen Pressfield. Both books are essentially about writing. Well, not just writing, just overcoming resistance in your life. What resistance is this force that tries to stop you from doing your true calling. That's how Stephen Pressfield describes it. You can chalk it up to a more logical explanation, like self-doubt, or something like that, or depression, but Stephen Pressfield describes it as resistance, and he tries to give you ways to fight this force called resistance so you can actually push through it and achieve the things that you're supposed to be achieving in life. I would say both of them are pretty excellent. I would highly recommend, if you're a writer, reading Stephen Pressfield's books are probably going to be beneficial to you. He has three, but he has three in this one series about resistance and turning pro and stuff like that. It's better if you go and find and read these books for yourselves, because I don't want to give you a cheaper version, because the information I feel like is that important. If you're an aspiring writer, try to get your hands on War on Art and How to Turn Pro by Steve Pressfield. Excellent books. Easily an 8 or a 9 out of 10. Next on the list is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, the annotated edition. Now this version is a little different than some of the versions of Meditations out there, but basically, if you don't know, Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor that is basically the stereotype of the philosopher king. He had a series of 9 journals, I believe, that we've recovered. I believe he had more, it's just the only 9 that we have recovered. And he was really into the philosophy of Stoicism. And if you're interested in Stoicism and the Stoics and stuff like that, well, I think everyone can pretty much agree that Marcus Aurelius is pretty much required reading. It's a pretty great read, I would say. It is a very intimate look into Marcus Aurelius's life and what he believes. Now, obviously, Marcus Aurelius is not 100% right, He's not infallible in all of his opinions, but a lot of the things he says I happen to agree strongly with. The idea that you can take truly bad things in your life and look at them as perhaps blessings from God because they are meant to help you grow and improve rather than looking at them as burdens. I believe that is an excellent way to look at life and an excellent way to look at the trials that we go through as humans. I would say that if you are really interested in philosophy, which if you are, you've probably already read Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, I would highly recommend reading Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. The annotated edition, translated, introduced, and edited by Robin Waterfield, is a pretty great version of this book. This is the version I think I would recommend. Yes, excellent. It's kind of hard to rate things like this, You don't rate it like you would a regular history book, because this wasn't meant to be read. This wasn't meant to be a book that we review and talk about how good the writing is, because it was just Marcus Aurelius and his thoughts. It's just basically going through his journals. I would still highly recommend this book. I'm not going to give it a rating out of 10 because it's really hard to give a rating out of 10 to someone's journal, to someone's deepest personal thoughts about what they feel about Stoicism and life and just these ideas like death will be upon us no matter how hard we try to fight it, and it's best that we just try to make the best of life before it gets us. I think it's an excellent book. Highly recommend it. Next on the list, since we're talking about philosophy, is The Book of Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi. Also an excellent piece of philosophy. But this one, it has some similarities, I would say, to some of the Stoic philosophies and meditations. I don't know if that's like a hot take or something unreasonable, but it is similar. But Book of the Five Rings is not just a philosophy book. It's a book on how to fight. The ideas in it are things like don't get used to using one sword, because the person who is really proficient with one sword and nothing else isn't as good as the person that's proficient in every kind of sword. That things like that are things that can be attributed to life as well. A lot of the lessons in here, I would say, aren't just attributed to sword fighting, but also just to life in general. And of course, even if you don't believe in a lot of the religious beliefs of Miyamoto Musashi, like if you're not a Shintoist, as I believe he was, there are still some useful things in here. And he even does get into the technical aspects of swordplay, which is interesting, though he often does specify that he can't get too in depth because he feels like he couldn't fully explain the sword, that it's something that you are going to have to understand for yourself. You have to understand, as he says, the way of your own blade. And in my opinion, based on the research that I've done, the way did remind me that this Miyamoto's The Way, quote unquote, the capital The Way, is very similar to capital, like to reason with a capital R, and things like meditations. I believe both of them kind of play hand in hand. I believe that they are very similar ideas, in my opinion. Though I could be wrong. That's the point of philosophy. You're supposed to discuss it and talk about it. But I would say definitely, if you're interested in philosophy and Japanese history in general, and the samurai and stuff like that, definitely give The Book of the Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi a look. The next book I also do not have a copy of, unfortunately, is Financial Peace by Dave Ramsey. Now, if you are struggling with finances and how to use your money, and even if you're not, I think this is a really useful book to read. Dave Ramsey breaks it down very easily, and even if you only take a few of the options he gives, it's still a tremendous help. You'll be surprised how much money you end up saving when you just start doing very basic things, like only buying things that you feel like you actually really need. And even if you do want something, maybe there's some sort of cheaper option out there and stuff like that. Now, you're probably saying, well, this stuff sounds basic. It does, but it's funny how little we use this kind of information despite the fact that it should be obvious. It's funny how we just ignore that kind of thing. I don't know. It's still a really useful book, and if you are struggling with finances and debt and stuff like that, I would highly recommend Financial Peace by Dave Ramsey. It's one I read to help my life. Next is another book I unfortunately do not have, and it is another work relating to Stoic philosophy, this time by Lucius Seneca, being Dialogues and Essays. Another required reading if you're into Stoicism. Pretty excellent look. It is very similar to Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, obviously, because it's studying the same philosophy, but more so in the personal way it's written, because these aren't journals in this case. A lot of these times it's just essays that he writes, like about anger and stuff like that, on how to control these emotions. And a lot of these are just letters that he's written to other people. Letters is a very similar premise and covers very similar ground to what Meditations by Marcus Aurelius covers. So I would basically be repeating myself. They do have some varying different beliefs. I do believe Lucius Seneca is more Stoic than Marcus Aurelius was, because Marcus Aurelius did subscribe to some of the Epicureanism beliefs, if I'm not mistaken. In fact, to the point where some people don't even consider Marcus Aurelius a true Stoic. I do, but I would say Lucius Seneca does cover lots of the same ground, and I would certainly say that it is still worth a listen. You can find it free on YouTube. I highly recommend. I might even put the link in the description, because it is a good read and does bring up some good points. Even if you don't agree with everything he says, the Stoic philosophy of trying to make the best of everything and to be virtuous and good to people and keep your head up high even in really bad situations. It's just really useful advice to have. Next book is another book I do not have, called On Writing by Stephen King. It is a non-fiction novel about basically how to write, and along with some biographical things about Stephen King's life. I would say it is certainly up there with Stephen Pressfield's 2 books about turning pro. It is a fantastic book about writing. And he does give some more specific information, like how to set up a scene, or where to find inspiration, or what kind of environment you should be writing in, that you shouldn't have an over-reliance on adverbs and stuff like that, because they're basically a crutch for imagery. It is a very useful book for the writer. If you are into that, I would highly recommend reading Stephen King's On Writing. It's a very short book, and it does get into some of the more personal aspects of King's life, like his childhood, up to the point where he almost died in a car crash in 1999, I believe. It's a great book. Would highly recommend for any aspiring writer. Coming up next is part 1 of the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, I believe is how you pronounce his name. Certainly an eye-opener of a book. I haven't even finished it in its entirety. That's why I've only got part 1 down, because it is essentially a book by itself. It's very dense, and there's a lot to go through, and it will melt your mind, and it will blow you away the kind of things men can do to each other. Things that you would be reading and you're like, that sounds like it's something from like a horror movie. There's no way anybody would actually kill someone like that. And it's all real. It's based on 200 separate eyewitness accounts, including the authors himself, who spent 8 months in a gulag in Soviet Russia. And it basically goes over the aspects of the secret police that was in Russia at the time, that, and a lot of the times anybody could be a secret police, so that means anybody could literally arrest anybody. and the way that the unfair way justice was dished out, like somebody could merely accuse you of speaking out against Stalin, over for you. You would be pretty much treated as if you were guilty until proven innocent. You would be beat, you'd be tortured, you'd be forced to basically admit that you did say something that was anti-Stalin, that you're basically a rightist in disguise. Very brutal book. Describing some of the things that happened would probably get this video taken down, because it's horrifically awful. One of the very best nonfiction works I've ever poured through. It is insane. It will blow you away. It goes over the evils of big government and stuff like that, and some of the ways power can corrupt, and some of the crazy, insane stories that go on inside the prison, and some of the psychological turmoil that can be had on one that spends time getting tortured inside these gulags, and some of the disgusting torture devices that are inside of it. If you don't have a strong stomach for that kind of thing, don't read Gulag Archipelago. But I would say it is essential reading for anyone that maybe believes that the gulags weren't bad places to be, because they were. It is such an incredible read. Highly recommend it. Even if you are queasy, I would still recommend reading at least a little bit of it, just to get an idea of how awful the gulags in Soviet Russia truly were. Next on the list is Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. This is a reread. It is one of my favorite sci-fi books, I would say. I read it when I was in 6th grade. I remember really liking it, and I had a copy of it, and I thought to myself, it's been a really long time since I've read Ender's Game, and I wonder if I would still like it. I read it, and I still really like it. The book follows Andrew Ender Wiggins as he is propelled into this military academy and basically forced to become a warlord because he is freakishly intelligent and is excellent at battle strategy despite his incredibly young age. And it basically goes through some of the depression, turmoil, and trauma that kind of treatment of a child can go through. And it's an excellent book. Would highly recommend. It's a solid 8 out of 10. I don't want to talk too much about it, even though it is a 30-plus-year-old book. The plot twist is too good to give away. I would highly recommend reading the book. It has one of my favorite plot twists in any book ever. It's pretty excellent. Highly recommend Ender's Game. Next is Apache Wars by Paul Andrew Hutton. This has to be one of the very best history books I think I've ever read. They could turn this into a TV show. It would be awesome. This is an excellent book covering the 20-plus year wars that went on against the Apache nations in Apachera, which is basically modern-day New Mexico and Arizona. If you're into Westerns and into Western history, and you're trying to write Westerns and trying to make them as accurate as possible, you're going to find very few books that do as good of a job as the Apache Wars at giving you all of the information in an entertaining way that you need for learning about the Apache and the conflicts that the United States had with the Apache. Few books will be as informative. The only other books I can think of that would be as good would probably be Empire of the Summer Moon by S.C. Gwynne, or Gwynn, I think it is, or Blood and Thunder by Hampton Sides. This book is excellent. One of the very, very best history books I've ever read. It feels like fiction. There are some crazy things that happen in this book, things that if they were written in a fiction novel would be considered contrived, would be considered like a plot hole. It would be insane. People would find it ridiculous that such a thing would even be in this, but it all happened, and it's all absolutely true. It is another history book that's very brutal, very violent. It goes into description about some of the ways people were maimed and killed. Same thing with Empire of the Summer Moon. If you're into Western history, highly recommend this book. It's a solid 8 or 9 out of 10. But I have to warn you, it's pretty grim. It's pretty depressing because the wars did not end on any kind of a happy note, unfortunately, for either side. Seriously, I highly recommend it, though. It's a great book. Up next is Dune by Frank Herbert. I had always wanted to read this book, and I started reading it last year and got pretty far into it, and then I stopped reading it for some reason. It wasn't because it was bad. It was a good book. I just felt like I wasn't ready for it at the time. And then I eventually came back to it shortly before the 2021 film was released, and what can I say what can I say about Dune that hasn't already been said about Dune? Yes, it is written weird. It has a strange way of shifting perspectives to other characters. Most books simply make you change characters in between scenes and in between chapters. This book will jump around in characters' heads all the time. You do not have to worry what any character is thinking. Frank Herbert will tell you, okay? Despite that, despite some of the weirdness, despite some of the things that people may find frustrating and off-putting about Dune, it's still an excellent piece of science fiction, if not the very best science fiction book ever written. The world building is pretty fantastic, is very well thought out. The writing is very good. The characters aren't the deepest in any book you'll ever read, but for this, they work. I feel like a lot of this is more focused on the more trying to create a big, bold world with interesting lore. This is the closest equivalent we have to the Lord of the Rings in the realm of science fiction, in my opinion, and it's pretty excellent. I would give it a solid 8 out of 10. Just be warned that it is written a little weird and it does take some time to adjust. But once you get used to it, it's a fairly quick read, despite being a pretty dense novel. Again, excellent book. And the final book I was able to read this year was True Grit by Charles Portis. This book has spawned 2 very critically acclaimed movies, both of which I think are good. Before anybody asks me in the comments, I get asked all the time which one I think is better, especially when I was carrying this around. People would ask me, like, oh, I got a question for you, which movie? And obviously, since I live in the South, people down here are pretty big fans of John Wayne, and they expect me to answer John Wayne, even though I like the remake a little more because I'm a Coen Brothers fan. But True Grit is another book that is written very differently. If you are not used to this style, it might turn you off. It's a great book. I would just say that if you're not used to it, it would definitely turn you off to it. The book essentially follows Maddie Ross as she goes on a hunt for the man that killed her father with the help of 2 men, Rooster Cogburn, who is a state marshal, and a Texas Ranger named LaBeef. His name is actually like LeBeau, but he pronounces it LaBeef because he's from Texas. The book is written like a memoir, which is one of the reasons I like the new movie, because it's got a lot of narration and stuff like that, typical of something like as if she was reading the memoir like this, like as if she was reading this out loud. The book is good. The dialogue is pretty snappy. I like the dialogue a lot. It's pretty well written. I would recommend it for fans of both films. If you're a big fan of Westerns and stuff like that, this book is basically essential reading. It is one of the Wild West classics that in this genre. Highly recommend. It's a 7 out of 10 for me. So, we are at the end of the video. That is every single book I read in 2021. I do plan on reading even more in 2022. I already have one of my books completed, War of the Worlds. I do plan on talking about that book soon because I really enjoy that book. Reread it for the first time in years, and it's excellent. I will be covering it soon, but I want to make a commitment to try to read twice as many books, at least, this year than I did last year, because I was not able to get a lot of books read last year because of certain circumstances that I'm not going to get into. But now I feel like I can actually get it done. I also do plan on making videos about writing and talking about my journey the journey that I've gone through in the last 3 years of me trying to get into a writing career. I'm also going to be talking about books and stuff like that this year that I enjoy. I do plan on having another video out this week, maybe next. Until then, have a happy new year, and I will talk to you guys later.